All right. Happy New Day, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us on today for today's career meetup. We have a wonderful guest speaker here today, Dr. Heather Bastian, who is going to talk to us about publishing your work. But first, I'd like to just introduce Dr. Bastian to you and read a brief bio. So, Dr. Heather Bastian earned her PhD in English with a concentration in rhetoric and composition in 2010. She has since worked in higher education as an English professor, teaching first year research and business writing courses, and as an administrator, overseeing 55 to 65 student employees every semester. She also freelances as a writing consultant for businesses and for business professionals. I would like everyone to give a resounding virtual round of applause to our special guest, Dr. Heather Bastian. Thank you so much.
Thanks, AJ. Um, Fun fact is AJ was a graduate student here and was my graduate assistant and did a fantastic job with working with me in the communication consultant program. So I'm so glad to see him here still at UNC Charlotte. So today I'm going to talk about publishing your work. So the big thing, whether you are publishing creative works or academic works, what you really have to do, and this is an essential step that people skip. They skip it all the time. They skip it in their college classes and they skip it when they move to their professional careers, is you have to do your research. You absolutely must do your research. You need to do this as you are working on projects, while you are working on projects. This is not a wait to do your research about publishers in the publishing industry. You should be doing this as you are creating because you need to know what outlets are available to you. There are lots and lots of publishing outlets available for creative writing, for academic writing. There are print ones, there are online ones. You can look at local or regional ones as well. Those are often, I think, specifically for people who are new to publishing or undergraduates. Not local and regional outlets might be a good place to focus your energy to get sort of your first publications, smaller, especially if you can gear it towards particular topics or themes that would interest the local or regional population. There's also the national level, though, then that you can look for that. You'll want to think about, are they referred? So are you going to get peer reviews from it? Are they going to be referred from editors? Are they self-published, non-referred? So that's all to say. And there are also ones, outlets that particularly target undergraduate students. So that's something else to know about that. If you're interested in publishing as an undergraduate, whether it's in creative writing or in academic writing, or even in another, like in art, or even interested in any kind of art, architecture, anything of the creative field, there are outlets that specifically look for undergrads and they'll encourage undergraduates to apply. So do your research, know what outlets are available to you and what you could publish in. What is realistic, and then as you're looking at those outlets, make sure you understand the audience. So who's reading that? And that's really key because that's going to help you think about what works do I send to this place? If you find an outlet that's going to work, what types of things do I then send to it? So just knowing what's available and who reads that, that's going to be essential to get this. After you've identified potential outlets, you'll want to read and review what's already been published in them. That might sound like a no-brainer, but it's really a key step because you want to know what type of things do they publish. Certain outlets, especially local or regional ones, like I said, might be looking, especially for creative writing, for certain themes, certain topics. Some often outlets will gear themselves towards particular things, particular issues. So know what's already been published in them. Are there common topics? Are there common themes, common ideas? Are there common formats, especially when you're looking at short stories? Are there particular kinds of short stories, particular kinds of organizations that they're looking for in it? So don't just look at content, look at how is it actually written as well. So what's the organization? What's the structure? what type of language is used. Look at all of that. And then also, when you're doing all this research, what are their specific publication requirements then? So if you find this outlet, you've read what's in there, you've looked at the audience, and you're like, I think this is a good outlet for me. This is a potential. What are their specific requirements for publication? You must follow those. If it says 500 words, it means 500 words. It does not mean 550 words. That will get kicked out, right? It will be. So know what those publication requirements are, whatever they might be. If it's particular fonts, particular formats, this all goes into publishing because a lot of it needs to then be reformatted. So they might have specific publishing requirements. Make sure you know what those are. My best advice here is actually to keep an Excel or a Google Doc sheet of all these possible outlets that you identify. And then you can put what are their specific requirements and also maybe link to what are things that have been published in them. So then you have this nice sheet that you can always go back to. And you can describe like, here, these are the themes of this one. But just a way to kind of organize these possible outlets that are available to you and keep track of, if I'm going to submit to them, here are the types of things I submit to them. Here are some examples of the types of things I submit to them. And this is exactly what I would need to submit. Here's the contact information, the editor, whatever it is. Because by the time you get ready to submit, you just want to be able to do it. You don't want to start doing your research then, because then you're not going to do it. You'll put it off and you'll put it off and you'll put it off. But if it's in there in a Excel doc, you can just go to it and get it done. Along those lines of sort of thinking about what's already been published in them, this is something I learned from an academic writing book, and I think it holds true though to any kind of writing or creative work that you want to do, even if it's multimedia art based, is you really should identify exemplars. And I really like this idea of exemplars because this is what you would like your work to be like. So it's like an aspiration. Like, here's the type of short stories I like. There's something you can go back to. It's something you can look at that language, look at that structure, look at that organization, look at the tone, look at the kinds of, look at the format, all of that. But sort of to go and say, like, this is what I would like my work to look like, sound like, read like. And then that can give you inspiration. It can help you when you're stuck. You can go find several of them. It's not like you need one exemplar. You might want your work to look lots of different ways, but here are different examples of what I think is really good. That's a good thing to have, even in that Excel sheet, just something you can go to, especially when you're feeling stuck or you want to know, or you need some ideas. If you get to the point where you are ready and you're like, okay, I have my exemplar, like I feel good about this, like I've identified the outlet, I know what they want, I have these exemplars, I have everything ready to go. Know that you can reach out to editors and publishers with specific inquiries if applicable. You don't have to, but if you are working, and I've done this very occasionally, I don't do it often, but I have in the past, when there's a specific section in a journal that'll be like, for example, one time I was working on a program profile, so a program that I was developing, and there was a journal that has a program profile section. And I wasn't sure if what I was thinking about writing was really going to fit that. So I reached out to the editor and I just said, hey, I'm working on this. I think it might fit in this section, but I'm not sure. And I just wanted to get your thoughts. And they wrote back, they were great. And they were like, yeah, this sounds like something we would be interested in. Please send it along. So if you have a specific, this is not just a general like, hey, I'm interested in publishing with you. What would you tell me? That's not going to get you a response. But if you're like, I'm working on this specific thing, I think it's a good fit for this specific thing that you do. What can I get your thoughts, or would you be interested in something like that? You can send those types of inquiry emails. If you don't hear anything back, though, that doesn't mean you also can't submit it. But that you can do that if it's applicable. And then when you get down to this last piece, if you kind of This is your gear your work to one publication outlet, but identify several possibilities. So when you decide, you get your spreadsheet and you're like, okay, here's what my target, like this is the journal or the publisher I'd like to work with. You can target it towards them then, their specific requirements, but make sure you have lots of backup possibilities. And we're going to talk about why next. But you want to make sure that you're targeting towards one, but identifying lots of backups because you're going to need them. Most likely you will need those backups. So this should give you a really strong basis so that as you're working on stuff and you're feeling like it's ready to send out, you already have all this collected, you already know it. It's going to help you develop whatever it is, whether it's an academic article, whether it's a short story, a novel. All of this background research about publishers, publishing requirements, outlets, this is going to help you create stronger work. Because you can start thinking then about, what am I going to do with this? It also can help some people, I think, with some motivation. If you have that end in sight at the front, like, okay, here's my target journal. I know I want to submit it here, or here's my target magazine, or here's the target publisher. This can kind of motivate you because you have that already. You know it's there. It's not a like, oh, I'm working on this and I'm going to send it out one day. You're like, I'm working on this and I'm going to send it out to this publisher and I'm aiming for this deadline. That can be helpful and useful. So do your research. The second big broad stroke recommendation or something to be thinking about is prepare to compose whatever it is you're composing, revise and submit often. You should be doing this a lot. Practice makes perfect, applies to any kind of composing. You don't go to the gym and get a six-pack. You don't show up once a week to writing and get a novel or an academic article. It doesn't happen, right? So you need to be setting aside that time every day or every other day, but often to write, compose, create, whatever it is that you're doing. And this is an important distinction, and a lot of people will recommend this in publishing, is separating the time that you're, when I say write, compose, create, I mean actually creating new material. Because there's a difference between creating new material and revising existing material. And you want to make sure that you aren't just revising existing material. And this is a trap I myself fall into all the time because I'm like, oh, well, I'm just going to mess with this paragraph for a while. And then I'm messing with that paragraph for like a month and I haven't written anything else because I'm stuck in that revising mode. So I kind of you have to really separate that time to, all right, for this hour, half hour, or whatever chunk you have, I'm going to write something new. And then I'm going to take this time to revise something I've already done. But really try to keep that as a separate time because some people, because like, yeah, I can set aside time every day and I can revise the same paragraph for a month. I know, I've done it. Like I will do that. Like especially if you're kind of spinning your wheels and you're not sure how to move forward, you can really get stuck in that existing material. You have to create new and put that time aside for that. A lot of people, and the more readers you can get, sharing your work with others is important. And the key here, though, is that critical piece. And I don't mean critical does not necessarily mean negative. Critical means somebody who's going to be honest with you. Who's going to give you honest feedback? Who's going to tell you the good things and who's going to tell you the bad things? Making sure that you're getting both perspectives. There are groups that often are out there. There could be writing groups. There can be specific, if you're looking at novels, short stories, you can look for people who are also working on that, or academic writing groups. The writing centers on many campuses might have places to start to find those types of groups, or they might be able to connect you to other people who come into the writing center to get feedback on that type of information. Connecting with faculty who might know other students, particularly for this when you're an undergrad, who might be able to connect you to that larger group. But those are other people who are also working on writing. usually the same kinds of writing. So if it's creative writing, they're creative writing groups or academic writing groups. Or find and hire a reliable editor. This depends what level you're at, and this is a key too, is a reliable editor. You can identify somebody to work as an editor, but it needs to be a reliable one, which is usually why you have to pay them because editing is hard work. But that is another option, especially, and if you're starting out, you might need to hire and pay them. If you get a publisher, then you're working with an editor, of course, and they're getting paid through the publishing company, or they're volunteering if it's the case of an academic journal, because we do everything for free. But that more feedback, the better is the key here. You want to get feedback. You want to get feedback from lots of different people, however that comes, whether it's a group, whether it's, and that editor can be a professional or it can be a trusted friend. But again, the key here is that they're not afraid to share with you bad and good news. And my last piece of advice for this composing, revising, and submitting often is plan to have more than one work in progress at different stages. This will allow you to move between projects because you might just get burned out on a project. So maybe you have one project that's more towards a final stage. You might have an idea in your head for starting another project. This isn't a, like, it's not to, you have to be careful because you don't want to get distracted and be like, never get anything to submitting. But I do think it's important to make sure that you can take some time away from a project when you need it, if you're not being productive with it. And having another project on the back burner can get you there, give you some creative energy, and then get you back to the other one. So this is kind of one of those, you got to be careful because you don't want to have a million projects and be juggling all of them. But to have 2 projects in play is not a bad idea. Even up to 3, I think some people can successfully juggle 3, even 4 projects. I find 2 is about all I can handle personally. But, and again, there have to be at different stages of the process. You can't have, like, if you have 2 that are at final, like, they'll be competing, but kind of staggering them. Because then also when you submit something, you want to be able to work on something else right away. Like, it's like, you got to get it up, like, moving. So you're going to have that backup to be working on. So be careful with that one, but at the same time, I think it's a good idea to have those multiple projects at different stages. So if you are submitting often and you are getting more feedback, this is very important. You should expect negative and positive feedback, but you will get negative feedback. This will happen. The first thing to do is, it can sting, it can feel bad. And sometimes it really feels bad. And I have been there, and anybody who has submitted, nobody has not had it hurt if you submit, because it can hurt when it's negative feedback. You've put a lot of time in it, you've put a lot of energy in it. It's usually something that you're passionate about, you care about, and even if the negative feedback, and it is often good feedback, it doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt. So take a deep breath, you walk away from it, and you come back after a nice long walk or a few days. So read it, put it down, and walk away if you have that immediate emotional reaction. I mean, I've gotten feedback and have cried from it and walked away and came back and then could actually process it. But, like, that's not a good place to start processing feedback, like when your first reaction is tears. And that project was published. It just was not what I wanted to hear at that point in time because I put a lot of time and energy into it. So expect that, though. That's going to happen. You're going to have an emotional reaction. Even if it is mostly positive news, you are only going to hear the negative when you first read it. That is all you're going to hear. All you're going to see is, and you're going to think, I'm a failure, I'm terrible, I didn't do anything right. And you are wrong, because this is important to keep in mind. Feedback applies to a project. It is not to you as a person or a writer or a composer or whatever you are, a creator. It does not apply to you. It applies to a project. The person who is giving feedback is not responding to you as a person. They are responding to what is on a piece of paper or on a screen. That is what they are responding to. So you really have to learn to take your self-worth out of the equation. And that is very, very hard to do. I think AJ, you kind of blew my mind with the 2010, like I got my PhD. I think my first publication was a few years before that. So I've been publishing now for a while, and I'd say it probably took me at least a decade at this to take my self-worth out of the equation. And even now, when I get negative feedback, like I've been working on an article with a friend, a colleague, for 5 years now. It's been rejected twice. We just got our third rejection, and that hurt a lot. And I was like, even then it starts creeping in, like, maybe I'm not a great scholar, maybe I shouldn't be doing this work. But I kind of have to take that step back and do that. This kind of leads to the next one: is negative feedback does not mean the project is not worth pursuing at all. And that's important to keep in mind. As I said with this article that I'm currently working on with a colleague, we're going to resubmit it again to the same journal. We've submitted it to one journal, it was rejected. We submitted it to another journal, it was a revise and resubmit. We revised and resubmitted it. It's another revise and resubmit, and we're going to revise and resubmit it again. Because I think it's worth pursuing. I know it is, actually. Like, I know it will be. And the feedback has been critical, but the feedback has been positive in ways that suggest it is worth pursuing. But it doesn't mean that you can't pursue projects that you get negative feedback on. At the same time, it might not be worth pursuing in its current form. It might need to really change. And that's what's happened with this project. Like, I can't even tell you how far away it is from the original article. It's like, it's been 2 different articles, and now it's going to go to a 3rd one. So it doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing, but you might need to make some major changes for it to be pursued. And sometimes it isn't worth pursuing. Sometimes you have to accept that. I've had projects that I'm just like, yeah, no, this isn't going anywhere, and I need to stop. Like, I don't want to take it anywhere. I don't want to do anything with it, and we're just going to stop it. And it's going to go in a drawer, and I might never come back to it. Maybe I will. So taking that negative feedback and saying, okay, what is it that I want to do with this? And I'll talk about that next. And the reason to really kind of learn that, taking that self-worth out, taking that deep breath, is because publishing takes a lot of time, a lot, and many, many iterations. It is not a quick thing. It is not going to happen overnight. Talk to any writer, any novelist. It is not something that happens right away. It's going to take time, which is why it's also good to usually have more than one project in the works, because it's going to take time. In the amount of time that I've been working on this article I was talking about, I've published 3 other articles. So, but it's going to happen. I know it will. So just know it takes a lot of time, and it can take many iterations. So when you get that negative feedback, the key there then is to really take that feedback constructively. And this is something that you really do need to learn how to do. It took me a very long time, and still does, especially because we have that really strong emotional reaction at first, that it's really hard to then take that feedback and use it constructively. And it took me a long time to get there, to be able, because you kind of have to put your self-worth and your ego aside and say, okay, what is this person really telling me? What are they saying and what can I use? So when you get that feedback, it's important to know that there are usually different things that you'll get with your feedback when you submit it. You can get a rejection. Know that rejection is the most common. The acceptance rate at some of the top tier academic journals can be under 10%. So this is like, it is the most common. It is most common that your work will be rejected. You might get a revise and resubmit or a resubmit. There's different ways that people will say it at different publishers, how they might do it. But we're interested in what you're doing here, but we're not ready to accept it. So you're going to have to like take this feedback and you can resubmit it to us. So we'll consider it again. Revise and resubmit are real good news. Like, I'm happy when I get a revise and resubmit. That's probably like I would imagine, I don't have the numbers to back it up, but I would say revise and resubmit is far more common than accept with revisions. And an accept outright with no revisions is like unheard of. Like, we accept this in its entirety and we want no changes. Like, that just doesn't happen. I mean, maybe occasionally, rarely, like, but they'll accept it, but they want some changes. They might not call it revisions. There might be something else, and that's when you would start working with an editor to make some changes, especially for creative writing. So those are sort of, they sound like different publications will give you different names for that, but knowing that rejection is the most common. Again, as I said, top ranking journals have maybe below a 10, somewhere between, maybe an 8 and 15% acceptance rate. That's a lot of articles that aren't being accepted. A lot of pieces aren't being accepted. It doesn't mean they're bad, but when you're getting that much stuff, it's all good. So what comes up depends, how does it get through, and that's working with the editor, knowing the journal, doing your research. You have a better chance of getting that revise and resubmit. So once you get that feedback, these are the steps, like very concrete steps that I recommend. Again, it took me a long time to kind of get here and doing these steps myself. So hopefully this will save a lot of you a lot of time and pain. So after you put your ego aside and you put your self-worth aside and you can come back to that feedback, summarize it into easy to digest bullet points. So what exactly am I being told here? And not just what needs to change, but what are they saying? Like, take their feedback and put it in your own words and bullet point it. So here is what they are saying. Like, you can even, if you want to do like, here's what they like, here's what they don't like, I mean, you can sort of take it and narrow it down and reorganize it, but put it into bullets that are easy to digest. Because you might have a review that's, almost 2 single pages long, but really it's only 3 revision suggestions. There's just a lot of information in there. So it's helpful to pull it out into, here are the things that they're saying. Because long does not mean that there are lots of suggestions. It could just mean that there's lots of detail with some suggestions. And then after you have it in those easy to digest bullet points, you can develop an action plan then for your bullet point and a rationale. And this is important because you don't have to accept every point of feedback. You can have your rationale there up front. So if I get feedback for, I think you should, you're missing, like, I think you should integrate. So this is for academic stuff. It's very common. They're like, here's some scholarship you didn't include. I think you should integrate that. So I have that as a bullet point. And I'm like, okay, I think I should integrate these scholars, but I'm not going to integrate these scholars, and this is why. And it's important to include that rationale then and there, because when you resubmit it, you usually need to include a rationale of some point that says, here are the revisions that I've made and why you've made them and how you've made them. And then if you haven't taken any major suggestions, especially if they're by the editor, So generally for academic journals, you'll get 2 reviewers and then an editor will condense and consolidate that review and say, here are the themes. If an editor has said it and you don't do it, you need to have a really good reason why, because they're the ones who are making the decision as to whether it's going to be published or not. That doesn't mean you have to do it, but you need to include the rationale there. And it should be convincing beyond, I don't want to do it, or I didn't, you know, there needs to be a reason why you didn't take that feedback. I think depending on the kind, and this is where readers vary, but I have always found that beyond I have one horror story out of all the things I've submitted. And the person said that I shouldn't even consider myself a researcher. My research was so poor. That was clearly not a productive piece of feedback. And it wasn't helpful. So I didn't really, and that article was in fact published in a different outlet. So it wasn't terrible. I wasn't terrible. And that was an unfair review. But I have found generally overall the feedback that I've gotten, even the critical feedback or the stuff that was negative, beyond that particular that one piece, one time, in over a decade of publishing, it's all been helpful. Even if I didn't take it, I was able to say, okay, why did the person give me this feedback? Like, there's something here that made them say this. Like, what is it that made them say this? So I think you'll usually find that the feedback is incredibly helpful. It strengthens the piece. That does not mean though that you will not get a stray comment that is just mean. I mean, it can happen. There are people who are just mean, and you might get something just mean. And then it's putting that aside. But for the most part, you're not going to get that. You're going to get people who are taking your work seriously, who are thinking seriously about it. And even if you don't take that piece of advice, because it might not be what you want to do, and that's okay, but then know that other people might say that too. So you need to have a reason for why you're doing it. So I tend to think no feedback is bad feedback. Besides saying, I think you're a terrible researcher. And actually, I even took that piece of feedback and I know exactly why that person said it. And it's because I didn't write the article that they would have written. And they didn't agree with some of my research methods, and that's fine. But that also was an opinion, not an actual valid point of feedback. It was an opinion. So I even took that though, and I took that into consideration when I resubmitted it to make sure I addressed in the article where that negative, nasty comment came from. So I think any feedback is helpful. But getting it into those easy to digest points, including that rationale and what you're going to do, that helps then when you resubmit it, because you will most likely be asked to add, have some description of what you've done and your rationale for that. So once you have that action plan and you have a sense of what you're going to need moving forward, then you can create that timeline for revision and resubmission. So given what I have here, what I need to do, what is it's going to take me 3 months, or it's going to take me, sometimes if you're very lucky, it can take you a month, like if it isn't that much and you have time to dedicate to it. Sometimes it's going to take you a year if you have to do, especially if you have to do additional research. So you can create that timeline for revision and resubmission. And knowing here too that this might be the time, depending on if you got a rejection, that doesn't mean that you don't do this. You do this and you get out your Excel doc and you see what other outlet I can publish in. So it doesn't mean you stop when you get that rejection. It's the most common one. That's when you take that feedback, you make it actionable, you create that timeline, you get out your Excel sheet and you say, where else could I submit this? And do I need to add any other bullets to this if I'm going to resubmit it to this new place, because they have different requirements, or they have different themes, or they have different things that they want to see. So you don't stop when that happens, but you create a plan then. One of the things that I think one of the worst things to do at this point when you get that rejection And I did this once with an article and I never went back to it. And I still like kick myself for doing it because I'm never going to go back to it. Is I got a rejection and basically I put it in a drawer and I never went back. I never looked at it again and it just sat there. And that happens, I think, a lot. And if you at least do bullets here 3 through 4, you at least try to keep that from happening. Because it is time, it is energy, it is something you want to see through and you can see it through. But you need to have a concrete plan or it won't, or it's going to go in a drawer, it's going to stay in your file, your folder, and it's not going to go anywhere. So thinking about that. And that's all I have. That was a lot, maybe not enough for some things that you're interested in. But I hope that gives you at least sort of some broad strokes of make sure you're doing your research first and foremost. Be prepared to be working on this all the time. Like if this is what you want to do, it's going to take time. Do it often. Expect that negative feedback, but you're going to get positive feedback too. And then take that feedback and make it actionable and take it constructively. Those are my big, broad strokes.
Yeah, that was super helpful. I took a lot of notes. There was one thing I was curious about, and I'm not sure about like the etiquette for this, or if it's even something that people do. So after you like submit something and maybe some time has passed, do you do like follow-up emails or letters or anything? Is that a thing?
This is a great question. Yes, you can do follow-up. Yes. So it really depends on the kind of system that they use. A lot of times now they go into like electronic systems where you submit it and you can like monitor the submission and you can see who's looked at it. Like not who, but like, did someone look at this? Did they give feedback on this? This is where I would say this probably depends on the kind of area you're publishing in. So for like academic journals, it is not uncommon to not get a response within 6 months. I would probably not follow up until 6 months. And I know I would actually, because that's when I follow up. I follow up at 6 months if I haven't heard anything. And I just send a like, you know, especially if it's in that system, you can just, there's usually even in that system like email and you can just say like, hey, I'm just following up. You probably have a number like on this just to see what its status is. For creative writing, I think it also, I would look at like when they publish. Because they, and if they have any, usually they'll tell you too, in their submission guidelines how long it takes to review. So if they're like, we generally review within 8 weeks, I think 8 weeks is pretty common to expect a turnaround for a lot of places. Even some academic journals say 8 weeks, but it really very rarely ever is. It depends if they're looking, if they have to wait for peers to do it. It depends what's going on. It depends if they're close to publishing an issue, especially for magazines. So they might have specific times and dates that they will, with like time frames. So that's all to say, see if they give you that information. Depending on how you submit it, you may be able to ask for it up front. Like, I'm just wondering, you know, like, here's my submission, this is what I'm doing. Do you have any, if they don't give that information to you, you could ask up front, like, do you have a rough timeline for how long it usually takes for you to review work?